Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Nicole Davidow and I'm an event coordinator here at the store where we are hosting all sorts of fabulous events, both at our Con Ave location and at Union Market twice a week and the Wharf twice a week. So make sure to keep an eye on all that good stuff. We also have supported events, trips, classes. For a full list of everything, you can go to politics-prose.com. Now, before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. If everyone could check their phones and make sure they are on silent, it would be much appreciated. After today's conversation, we will have a Q&A. You'll be able to line up here at this microphone to have your question asked. We do ask that you try your best to get to that microphone because we are audio recording and want to capture your brilliant thought. After the Q&A, we'll have a signing line. You'll also sign up here at this white pillar, and you'll be able to purchase one of the books from our fabulous booksellers at the front of the store. We'll also ask that you fold up the chairs and put them against a sturdy shelf, but I'll remind you of all of that later, so don't worry about it. So now, without further ado, I'm thrilled to be welcoming Sasha Abramsky to celebrate the release of his book, Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small-Town America. In Chaos Comes Calling, Abramsky investigates the empowerment of the far-right over the past few years, stoked by the Trump presidency and the COVID-19 pandemic. He tells the parallel stories of two communities, Shasta County, California, and Sequim, Washington, where toxic alliances of QAnoners, anti-vaxxers, Christian nationalists, militia supporters, and other denizens of the far right have worked to take control of the levers of power. The trajectories of both communities expose the stark divisions and extremisms that have come to define our political landscape over the past decade and offers revealing glimpses of what the future may hold. Abramsky is the Nation magazine's Western correspondent and is a longtime political journalist and book author who has spent the last 30 years exploring the American political and social justice landscape. He has written extensively on poverty, criminal justice, immigration, and the rise of hard-right and alt-right political movements. Abramsky will be in conversation with Chris Lehmann, the D.C. bureau chief for The Nation and a contributing editor at The Baffler. He was formerly editor of The Baffler and The New Republic and is the author, most recently, of The Money Cult, Capitalism, Christianity, and the Unmaking of the American Dream. Now, enough of my voice. Please help me in welcoming these two wonderful gentlemen to the stage.
Thank you all for coming out. You can probably do the math, but I'm Chris Lehmann, and this is Sasha Abramsky, who conveniently has his book here for you to admire and later purchase. This is a very revealing and timely work, especially because we're now officially, as of Labor Day, in general election mode in this country, and the entire Republican Party is engaged in a project of trying to create mass amnesia around what it is like to be governed under the MAGA movement. And Sasha has delivered a really bracing and detailed on-the-ground account of just what happens when this ideology takes hold at the local level and how neighbors are sort of torn asunder and basic government functions are put in jeopardy. He's going to open tonight with a reading, driving home those points and others. So without further ado, the author.
All right, well, first of all, it is absolutely wonderful to be here to launch the book in a store as filled with ideas as this place is just exhilarating to me. So to the bookstore, thank you for letting me launch my book here. And to all of you, it's great to see faces I know as well as faces I don't know. I was planning to stand at the podium, but this chair is so elevated. Can you guys at the back see and hear me if I stay seated? I'll just do it that way. So the book is set in two counties in the northwest of the states. One of them is Shasta County in the very far north of California. And we think of California as a sort of, pretty liberal place, the kind of place that Donald Trump likes to bash whenever he can. parts of rural California, in the north especially, are actually really, really conservative. And this one county, Shasta County, sort of got lots and lots of headlines early in the pandemic when it expelled and recalled its already conservative Board of Supervisors chair and replaced him with basically a militia-aligned, hard-right, anti-public health care, anti-mandate, anti-everything Board of Supervisors. So one strand of the story is in Shasta, and the other strand is this little town called Sequim, and it is spelled Sequim, but like Soho and south of Houston in New York, if you know it, it's actually Sequim. It's a pronunciation thing, and that's in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And that's a far less right-wing place, but in a fit of absence of mind, it kind of accidentally elected a QAnon mayor early in 2020. I think it was 2020. And also got a lot of attention because at the time, no elected official in the country had publicly aligned with QAnon. Now, this is how far we've devolved in the years since then. Now, sort of, it's a dime a dozen that you find these sort of QAnon-sympathizing elected officials seeded throughout the country. But it was a sort of warning sign of what could happen if local democracy guardrails started to break down. And I did reporting for The Nation on both of those places. And I thought that there was something emblematic here, that if you could tell the story of these, you know, in some ways very ordinary, not particularly standout communities, you could tell the story of modern day America and what was happening because of the rise of social media and what was happening because of the rise of Trump and all the demagogy that went around Trump. And then what was happening when you layered the pandemic on top of all of that. And so that's the origins of the book. The passages I'm going to read to you are from right near the start of the book. And the character I'm going to begin with is a lovely young lady called Dr. Allison Berry. And she's a young public health officer. She was the public health officer for the county of Clallam, which is the county surrounding Sequim on the Olympic Peninsula. And she had sort of been very proactive in pushing a series of public health mandates and restrictions early in the pandemic, and progressively aroused the wrath of these sort of, you know, really quite violent online trolls and really quite violent in-person opponents. And in 2021, and this sort of, you know, in some ways is distant history, but I'm sure you all remember it. In 2021, the vaccines were released. And suddenly the game changed. And we went from sort of all being, you know, desperately locked down to having that chance of getting vaccinated and gradually reopening society again. And Washington State, like every other state, tried to navigate that. How do you reopen society without an explosion of infections? Because not everyone's vaccinated, or not everyone's double vaccinated, or whatever it might be. And they began opening and rapidly saw this huge increase in infections. And public health officers like Dr. Allison Berry very quickly realized that the infections were being spread in cafes, restaurants, and bars, overwhelmingly. And Dr. Berry decided that if she could put in place a vaccine requirement, where you had to show proof of vaccination to go into a restaurant or a cafe, you could very rapidly drive down the infection rates and make the reopening of society much more feasible. And so she put in place a local vaccine mandate. And within hours, quite literally within hours, social media had spread word of this horrible infringement on individual liberties, and she was getting death threats from all over the world. So the passage I'm going to read to you begins with what happened to Dr. Berry. And I've got 6 pages here. You guys are my guinea pigs in a way. You're the first reading I've done for this book. So I'm guessing that I've got about 12 or 13 minutes of reading. If I go on way, way, way too long and somebody wants me to shut up, please just wave and we'll go immediately to the conversation. You'll time me. All right, good. Recently separated from her husband and raising her toddler daughter as a single mom, Berry suddenly found herself front center stage in a bitter conflict that risked tearing the country apart. Armed mobs began showing up outside her public health offices, threatening to lynch the doctor and her colleagues. When the phones rang in her office, her colleagues girded themselves, knowing that there was a pretty good chance the person on the other end of the line would begin hurling obscenities at them as soon as they answered. When Barry opened her emails, she steeled herself for the barrage of hateful, frequently obscene messages that would flood her inbox. And I should warn you, there is R-rated language coming up. Generally, Barry felt, with admirable pride, that she was hard to scare. But as she admitted, I was scared here. I was absolutely scared here. I'm definitely scared of white supremacists and misogynists who want me dead. The emails especially gave her the chills. You're a brazen hypocrite who gets off on torturing children, much like your creepy Nazi Pope gets off on torturing puppies. Moreover, you and anyone going along with your mass coerced medical experiment and the prolonged torture of children will face judgment, went a fairly typical one dated October 28th, 2021. After a few more venomous paragraphs, the author signed off with a happy Halloween. It was, to say the least, creepy. But when Barry forwarded it to the sheriff's office, the sheriff determined that it didn't rise to the level of a specific criminal threat. On Facebook, one outraged anti-vaxxer waxed that, quote, "It is my religious freedom to not get vaccinated." And then, using most unreligious language, he waned, "Fuck every single one of you cunts." Hundreds of miles to the south, in California's sparsely populated Shasta County, Public Health Officer Karen Ramstrom, along with her supporters in county government, were facing a similar set of terrors. As COVID spread, and as public health officials desperately tried to craft legislation to keep the populace safe, talk radio hosts would go on their shows and tell their audience of anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, anti-rhinos, Republicans in name only, and anti-Black Lives Matters that it was time for blood to flow in the streets. Quote, "Communists only recognize the limits of their power when their necks are stretched," opined one shock jock on the Reading-based KCNR 1460 AM radio station, whose shows were subsequently scrubbed from the station's archives after he veered too far into the language of violence. A Facebook group called Open Shasta put up a posting about, quote, "taking out Dr. Ramstrom." A flood of other online threats soon followed. Anti-vaxxers picketed the public health officers. Fearing violence, the Reading Police Department ramped up patrols of Ramstrom's neighborhood. So intimidating were the threats that for a short time, Ramstrom even had a security team stationed outside her house. She put up cameras around her home. After a slew of particularly horrifying threats, she had to give statements to investigators from the DA's office. When she looked to the county's elected officials for support, Ramstrom was rebuffed. Several hard-right members of the county board of supervisors pointedly refused to meet with the public health officer to show their support for her in light of the threats that she was facing. Instead, they urged their colleagues to go to bat against the county's and the state's public health responses and to refuse to enforce the lockdown, non-essential business closings, and masking mandates. When the more moderate members balked at this, the hard-right contingent, backed by local militias, parents' rights advocates, and a bevy of fundamentalist churches, pushed a recall campaign against them, and in doing so, turned Shasta County into an epicenter for a burgeoning anti-vaccine and anti-masking movement building to a head across America. By 2022, most of the moderates had been driven out of county government. Ramstrom herself, after enduring months of protests against her, had been fired, as had many of the other top officials in public health and community services in the county. And the new hard-right majority on the Board of Supervisors, perhaps having realized the political potency of a heavily armed crowd, was pushing to make the rural locale a, quote, Second Amendment sanctuary county. Now I'm going to read you a couple more passages just to sort of give you more of the context of what was happening here. The advent of social media, initially marketed as an untrammeled good, as a historic expansion and democratizing of the information delivery process, has instead helped to spread propaganda, to break down trust in traditional news sources, and to trap consumers within ever more powerful echo chambers. The rise of Donald Trump, with his extraordinary skills as a demagogue, and the emergence of a personality cult around him, has made rational government seem almost a quaint throwback to a calmer, saner past. The proliferation of powerful racial, sexual, and gender justice movements and the fierce cultural backlash against these movements have fundamentally and rapidly reshaped the country's cultural domain. Throw into the mix unprecedented environmental degradation and weather calamities, from apocalyptic wildfires that leave thousands of people homeless to once-in-a-thousand-year storms and floods. The emergence of an increasingly conservative federal judiciary, the horrific proliferation of semi-automatic weapons on America's streets, and an extraordinary number of mass shootings, escalating chaos around abortion access, cascading levels of homelessness, the fentanyl epidemic, the after effects of a half-century of mass incarceration, and then to cap it all, a once-in-a-century pandemic, and more than a year of punishing lockdowns and quarantines, and you have all the ingredients for a time of startling political upheaval and chaos. It is out of this petri dish that the violent mobs confronting Dr. Perry at the height of the pandemic grew. Absent the intoxicating power of social media, where veiled by anonymity, users can and do lean into conspiracy thinking and insults, it's unlikely that these mobs would have coalesced in such a manner. Absent, too, the political demagoguery of the Trump era and Trump's efforts to politicize the pandemic lockdowns and mask mandates for his own short-term advantage, and it's unlikely that the rage would have been so intense. After all, Sequim, with its picturesque bungalows, its pretty little steepled churches, its 1950s diner in Pride of Place halfway along Washington Street, its cafes advertising locally roasted coffees, its arts and crafts stores and its abundance of well-heeled retirees wasn't exactly a hotbed of social despair. Sure, it had its fair share of problems, from drug addiction to young folks struggling to make the rent, but no more so than most other small towns dotting the peninsula, and far less so than many larger cities. Absent the furies and fears, the you're with us or you're against us absolutisms unleashed by America's endless culture wars. And it's hard to see how Dr. Berry would have come to be seen by so many of her neighbors as an enemy of the people. Put all these factors together, however, mix them up and sprinkle the resulting political fury, political fairy dust over a community, even a community as seemingly anodyne as Sequim, and unsurprisingly, bad things start to happen. By the time that the COVID pandemic arrived on America's shores, the country was a tinderbox, with incivility and intolerance spreading throughout the body politic, with yelling and social media insults replacing genuine political discourse, and with feeling replacing fact in all too many debates. And I'm going to read you one last bit, and then we're going to get on to the conversation. What happens when the residents of a small town or county look in the mirror and realize that everything is cracked, that their own sense of self is being eviscerated by the sharp edges of the broken glass? Does the destructive take no prisoners drift of modern politics and the rightward lurch of regions such as Shasta accelerate? Or does the chaos eventually trigger a reckoning, one that ultimately recalibrates politics back towards the center? Over the coming years, which of these two forks in the road will America take? Will the scorched earth vision of Donald Trump, of Steve Bannon, of Marjorie Taylor Greene, of Tucker Carlson, and of Alex Jones become the new norm, fundamentally reshaping the republic into something more closely resembling Viktor Orban's Hungary and his experiment in a liberal democracy? Will the world vision of QAnon win out? In 2018, Steve Bannon, the Rasputin of the right, the Svengali of MAGAism, stated that, quote, "the real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit." That's a quote. Disorient the public, convince them to distrust established sources of information, muddy the waters when it comes to filtering out truth from falsehood, and Bannon believed a slide rightward would naturally follow, break down confidence in government institutions, and it would be only a matter of time before a movement like MAGA could, quote, "deconstruct the administrative state." Bannon once teased his audience that he viewed himself as a Leninist, not because he supported Vladimir Lenin's ends, not because he wanted to create a Soviet Union of the United States, but because he recognized the destabilizing force of Lenin's take no prisoners revolutionary means. Will the alt-right fever dream of a pure nationalist state, unfettered by global alliances and treaties, its members freed of any obligations outside of their immediate community, conquer us? Will the nativism and the xenophobia, the distrust of sexual and cultural and racial minorities, draw in ever more foot soldiers to the alt-right cause? Or will these corrosive forces burn out in the face of growing public unease and even repugnance at all that is lost when extremists seize the helm? It is in local communities throughout America, in ordinary places such as Sequim, Washington, and Shasta County, California, that this challenge will be met. And it is in these same locales and in the actions of residents in response to political chaos that the answers to the above questions will, over the coming years, be found. Thank you. And you guys were timing it. How long was that? All right.
All right.
Good enough.
Yes, more applause. Yeah, well, given that bracing and, rather bummerific introduction to the topic, I do feel like maybe we should briefly just fast forward in terms of the book's contents to assuage people with the important moral here that that question that Sasha left off with in his reading was partially answered in a positive way, chiefly in Sequim. The results in Shasta County are more equivocal. Sequim, there was a good government group of citizens who decided they sort of had enough with the apocalyptic rhetoric and the social media threats and the conspiratorial mania coming from chiefly its mayor, and managed to vote most of the MAGA contingent out of power. And there was a recall election in Shasta, whose main target narrowly survived, but the real bad actors there were also defeated. And I guess my question to you, since we are in this charged moment politically right now, is what do you see, A, as kind of the tipping points that helped bring that transformation to pass? And, given the question you left off with in your reading, what are the lessons? We're in Washington, we make it, everything here is about national politics, and we're in an election year. What do you see, as we are facing yet another referendum on the Trumpist model of government as the larger political lessons here?
Yeah, I'm torn with how to approach this book, because on one level it's a political thriller, and so I almost think there should be a spoiler alert before we tell the ending.
That's true. Sorry,
but no, I mean realistically, it's going to come up in conversation again and again and again, which is that there is this divergence because Shasta quite quickly organized resistance to the sort of takeover by these QAnon supporters. And what had happened Sequim, not Shasta. What had happened in Sequim was more a fit of absence of mind, that it wasn't a sort of particularly right-wing community. It's just that in most elections locally, people don't tend to pay that much attention. If I asked you guys, who's your county board of supervisors, some of you would know, a lot of you wouldn't know. I couldn't tell you who my county board of supervisors members are. I could tell you who my mayor is, but I live in a big city. There are lots of communities where political participation is minimal. You get 20, 25% turnout at local elections, if that. And people just don't pay attention, and they sort of think it doesn't matter. They may know who their congressman is, they may know who their governor is, hopefully, but the local politics sort of slips under the radar a bit. And so what happened in Sequim was these right-wing extremists got elected basically because people weren't paying attention, and very, very rapidly created an environment of chaos. And the reaction was a good governance league. People started basically organizing, knocking on doors, educating people at community meetings, and explaining how local government worked and why you had to pay attention and take part. And within one election cycle, they began rolling back the damage of these extremists. It didn't happen in Shasta County. Shasta had sort of, for various reasons, been veering rightward for a generation anyway. And the COVID pandemic had basically been an accelerant poured onto a fire that was already there. And so in Shasta, the braking mechanisms weren't there. It took years and years for the equivalent of a good governance league to start. It did start last year. And it had sort of, as Chris said, partial success in rolling some of this back, but very spotty. And in a lot of ways, Shasta just continued rolling rightward. You asked about the impact. The impact, we do think about it in the Trump era of, everything being national. And, we spend all this sort of emotional energy looking at Trump and, I certainly do. I doom scroll. What crazy thing has Trump said next? What awful national policy is he proposing? What's going to happen to the republic when, if Trump gets elected, God forbid. But on the ground, locally, the consequences are just as big. Because the thing is,
Right.
If local government becomes an ideological war ground, potholes don't get filled. After school programs shut down, local drug treatment centers don't get funded. Things that need to happen locally just to keep society oiled, to keep the sort of basic, sort of everyday rhythm of life going on, start to break down. So if you have a situation in Shasta County where the County Board of Supervisors is more concerned about entirely symbolic resolutions that they can send down to Sacramento saying, we don't like your public health mandates, and then we thumb our nose at them, which is basically what they kept doing. Or if they, again, sort of come up with this entirely symbolic thing, we're a Second Amendment sanctuary county. It doesn't mean anything at all. You can already get almost whatever guns you want in this country. We have 400 million guns in this country. But Shasta County's County Board of Supervisors wanted to pass a resolution saying that you could buy even more guns and be even less likely to be prosecuted in Shasta. Well, if that is where local government heads, just the basic stuff starts to disintegrate. And so, you asked where the tipping point is. The tipping point is basically when local people get fed up because nothing works. Mm-hmm. And they get fed up with these endless ideological battles that sort of sound like they're about big issues, but in actual fact, avoid the big issues locally, which are things like housing and education and, road quality and all those things. And so I think that's where the tipping point is. I did quite a bit of reporting in Maine last year. Do any of you remember a governor in Maine called Paul LePage?
Oh, of course, yes.
You're smiling in the back. So LePage was, Trump before Trump. He was bombastic. He was loud. He said stupid shit because he knew it would annoy people. And he was governor, I think he was a 2-term governor about 10, 15 years ago. And I went out to Maine then and I profiled him. And, this guy was a clown, but he was quite effective until he stopped being effective because he didn't deliver the goods. He wasn't able to deliver on his rhetoric. And LePage ran for re-election again last year or 2 years ago, having been out of office because he'd been term limited out. He tried to make a comeback. And I went back to Maine. I did a story for The Nation. And basically what I concluded was, what is going to happen in Maine is going to have tremendous ramifications for what happens when Trump runs for re-election. Because in Maine, LePage was betting on people forgetting the chaos of demagogy. Right. He was betting that he could just scrub that and that people would say, yeah, things weren't that bad under Paul LePage and the economy was doing quite well and blah, blah, blah. We'll re-elect him. It turned out the public had a pretty damn good memory of the chaos he'd unleashed, and he was trounced when he tried to run for re-election. I think that might be indicative of what will happen in November here. Hopefully, is that, there is a cultural memory of the chaos of
like
demagogy.
Maine.
That was a long answer to your question. I apologize.
No, it was a long question. And you actually just reminded me, there were recently local elections in Washington State, where Sequim is, which for very sort of arcane reasons, political scientists regard as significant bellwethers of a presidential cycle. And I'm not usually a dealer in opium, but it's sort of the same thing. The Democratic margins were kind of double what had been forecast, and the political wisdom says that augurs a blue wave. So perhaps this lesson is very slowly and much too late sinking in with the general election, the electorate. The other thing I wanted to bring up by way of a tipping point that's sort of, again, familiar to us in the DC metro region is I do think you're right. I do think the mandate of local government just to deliver basic social goods is, always the top priority. And when those goods begin to deteriorate, consequences ensue. And I think we saw in the 2022 cycle with the Virginia gubernatorial race was then held as the big bellwether, right? And Glenn Youngkin successfully demagogued the critical race theory moral panic. And what's been interesting, and The Nation has reported on this, Jen Berkshire, who I worked with as a writer for a long time, wrote several great pieces for us about this. The critical race theory panic was a electoral washout for the right. And I think it's for the same reasons that you were suggesting, that people actually interact with the government at the level of their local schools. And if you have people coming in and telling you that, teachers are Satan worshipers or Maoists or whatever, they're not going to believe it. They just understand, look, there are problems, maybe priorities could be different. But, and we also don't want our libraries ransacked by Ron DeSantis and Moms for Liberty.
So. And actually, I'm glad you talked about that.
There's a library story.
One of the bizarre things I realized when I was reporting this, and I certainly hadn't sort of gone into it thinking that, but I realized when I was reporting it that the online trolls who in 2020 and 2021 had been sending death threats, these totally crude, vulgar messages to public health officials, some of which I quoted in the reading, the exact same people had the same Twitter tags, the exact same people by 2022 had shifted their focus. And they were now all into the critical race theory and the transgendered issues. And it was completely insane to me. And, I mean, again, you can make a lot of noise online without representing a lot of people. And so you have a handful of people, or maybe more than a handful, but you have a small group of people just amplifying this noise, first about vaccine mandates, but then by 2022 or 2023, these moral panics. Our kids are being taught critical race theory. Our kids are being taught to criticize America, God forbid. Our kids are being taught that, their gender is not what they think it is, et cetera, et cetera. These panics that set in and that may sort of last for one or two electoral cycles. They may, actually, reap some far-right benefits electorally for one or two cycles, but then it burns out. And you talked about Virginia. I mean, this is, 2-3 years ago, all anyone was talking about in the election in Virginia was critical race theory. I can't imagine that's going to be the dominant discourse in 2024 in the election in Virginia. It's just these things sort of burn very, very passionately and brightly, and then they burn out because they don't actually impact people's lives every day in a real way. It's the worst kind of sort of symbol politics. So my hope is that 2024 is about, my hope is that we don't fight entire elections based around cultural war issues, but that we actually fight elections based around on-the-ground realities about, what these extreme right movements mean for people's lives on the ground, because they don't mean anything good, and they do generate endless realms of chaos.
Well, here again, I'm going to veer from hopium back to cynicism and say, the function of the culture wars on the right is precisely to prevent people from engaging with those issues and to notice that massive tax cuts are being given away to the wealthy, that wages are stagnant for people in the care economy. So once you drop the mask of culture warfare, and the right's been pretty candid about this, they know that their agenda is actually not a majority agenda. So you do need, that's the function of culture warfare.
No,
in this setting.
absolutely. I mean, you can't imagine the Trump presidency and you can't imagine the Trump candidacy in 2024 without the language of cultural war. I mean, the idea of Trump having a serious, calm, dispassionate policy conversation about anything other than sort of bombast, it's just not going to happen. If Trump goes to that debate stage next week, and I still, suspect that when push comes to shove, Trump will not show up. But if Trump shows up, you can bet your bottom dollar that he will not be talking about serious policy. He will be throwing insults, and he'll be casting aspersions on Harris's race or sexual identity, whatever it will be. It will be insult based because he doesn't have a policy platform, and this is
right.
One of the sort of things in my book. One of the real bad guys in the book is the County Board of Supervisors chair, who replaced the moderate. And the new guy was a guy called Patrick Jones, and he ran a gun store, and he was a religious fundamentalist, and he believed that homosexuality was a sin, and he had this package of ideas that were sort of straight out of John Birch from the 1950s, added in with a QAnon dollop. But he was also deeply incompetent. He just could not make government function. And even in a far-right community like Shasta County, eventually his voters lost patience with him. And in the primaries in March, I think it was, he was defeated. So, there are limits, even in a place like Shasta, where you sort of look at it and you think, oh my gosh, it's just skidding off into, political insanity. At some point, people get bored with the culture war and they realize it doesn't answer their fundamental political needs. And I suspect, and again, I'm not being Pollyannish because I'm biting every nail I have in the run-up to November, but I suspect when push comes to shove that there's just enough people in this country who don't want another 4 years of this complete insanity because it doesn't deliver governance properly. That's just my hope.
Right. From your lips to God's ears, as we say in the Midwest. It's funny, when you were reeling off the pivot, which you do narrate very powerfully in the book, from the sort of COVID fear-mongering to the CRT anti-trans propaganda, I was also recalling, and this is how this sort of makes your point about how quickly we cycle through this. Does anyone even remember the immigrant caravan in 2018? That was like, back then, it was the first midterms under Trump, and he had run for office demagoguing on the border. And Fox News was wall to wall with coverage of this, what they depicted as this frightening horde of, criminals and rapists and coming up through Central America to the southern border. On the first Wednesday in November after the election, they pulled the plug on all that coverage, and Media Matters has actually done, numbers running where they had 400 stories on the immigrant caravan up until the election and then gone. So I think one of the many virtues of your book is you draw attention both to the utter non-functionality of these culture wars in a political context, but also this very, I don't even know how to describe it, this plug and play Mad Libs quality to all of these culture wars. I often think people on the right just have to be exhausted at this point, right? Like, it reminds me, there's a very good Onion headline that just reads, right, exactly. Conservative man proudly afraid of everything. And that is actually the agenda here. And it is, it is a prescription, as Sasha writes, for chaos on the local level. I also wanted to get into the social media part of your argument, because that's, what you describe as a fierce accelerant of all this. And what's heartbreaking at the local level is you see these people who are neighbors, who, have worked in various public settings to live peaceably with one another, suddenly, issuing death threats, and, the hair-raising talk radio rhetoric you quote there, and it's just, I not to make this about me in any way, but I come from a part of the country that was rapidly deindustrialized during the farm crisis. It's in eastern Iowa, was an epicenter of the Trump movement in 2016. And I, made my best effort, not in the New York Times, Cletus safari way of parachuting into the Midwest and talking to Trump supporters at diners, but, I knew these people. I knew they weren't bone deep racists. I knew, someone had taught them to think this way. And also there was a policy apparatus in the Democratic Party that did actually transport those jobs overseas and didn't leave much of a version of the American dream behind. So I guess my question to you is, there is a sense of community people get out of the MAGA movement. Yeah. And I'm hoping that out of the Harris-Walz moment, something similar emerges on the liberal left. But how do you get that back, both at the local level?
I think, the weird thing about the MAGA movement, especially in the pandemic, was that in some ways they were using the methods and maybe the emotional connections of the new left in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. It was this sort of idea of sort of a little bit of anarchy, a little bit of fun. I mean, if you're locked down in the pandemic and suddenly you have these groups on the outright saying, yeah, it's all a hoax, come out to go to the rodeo, right, which is what happened in Shasta County, quite literally. They had a rodeo at the peak of the lockdown. If you're offering fun to people who are feeling desperate, whether economically or culturally desperate, it's seductive. And I think, for reporters, that's something we've missed. We look at the outright and I look at the outright and I'm horrified by the politics. But it wasn't just the politics, and it isn't just the politics, it's the community it provides. And I talked with a lot of people who had sort of veered ever more rightward, especially during the pandemic. They started listening to these right-wing podcasts. They started reading these sort of conspiracy theories from the right. And I listened to it, and I listened to the rhetoric, and I was shocked, actually, by how much of that rhetoric was familiar to me. Because I grew up in a very lefty environment. Cindy, you know my mum. I mean, I grew up in an environment very heavily influenced by the leftist politics of the 1960s. And I was stunned by how similar some of that rhetoric, the anti-government rhetoric, the suspicion of authority, the suspicion of law enforcement, in a different universe, a lot of those people who gravitated to MAGA could have gravitated to, Abby Hoffman in the 1960s. There's just something very malignant and malicious happened along the way, and it became an extremely right-wing nationalist, regressive movement. But I think a large part of it is about the community, and a large part of that community is seeded online and social media. What I'd love to do, I was told we had about 20 minutes for questions at the back end of this, and I don't want to eat into that. Yeah. Can I throw it open to you guys to ask questions or make comments? Yeah. And I know there's a microphone, so it's recorded.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your tremendously informative work on this vital topic to all of us. While I absolutely despise Trump as a person and a leader, my assessment is that he's been brilliant at essentially creating and leading the MAGA movement. And I mean, his role in it has been by far and away the primary catalyst for the results it's achieved, which are not inconsiderable in the American political sphere. My desperate hope is that he's going to lose in November, as I'm sure almost all of us here feel the same way. And given that how critical I think he's been to catalyzing the MAGA movement, my hypothesis is that it will collapse without him. It will fade away, and slowly but surely the conservative elements of the country will coalesce around a more rational, more moderate set of attitudes and policies. Do you share that hypothesis?
By and large, I think that any cult of the personality definitionally revolves around the personality. It's very hard to see if Donald Trump loses, again. Very hard to see who replaces him at the epicenter of that personality cult, and it's very hard to see how. I mean, he could continue to, lead that personality cult into his 80s or into his 90s, but it would be a smaller and smaller group of sort of diehards who go. It would be the sort of Jim Jones contingent. That said, I think he has changed American politics profoundly enough that even without him, the Republican Party isn't going to look the same in 2030 as it looked in 2010. There's something, he's unleashed something that is not going back in the bottle. So I think you're right to the extent that the sort of the immense power, the centrifugal power of Trump, that goes when Trump goes. But the politics of nationalism, the politics of xenophobia, the sort of really ugly, coarse politics that he's unleashed, I don't think that's going away. I think we're going to have to navigate, and partly that's because social media isn't going away, and social media seems to sort of crudify politics all over the world. So I think that's something we're going to have to grapple with for many, many years. I'm not sure we have the legal tools or the educational tools, or maybe not even the moral language to deal with what he's unleashed. So I don't think it goes away when he goes away.
This was fascinating. I do think it's important to separate what happens at the local level from what happens at the national level, because there's a piece in the national level that doesn't happen at the local level, and that's money. Republican business money. My question is actually very narrow. I'm a physician. Did you look at Shasta County or Shasta to see if there was any difference in the mortality rate? And in that connection, was there a legal mandate from the state to get vaccinated and wear masks that they disregarded, or was there no mandate because there couldn't be?
That's a really good question, and the answer is I did look at that, and the answer is that the thing is there were vaccine. There were vaccine mandates in certain professions that were statewide. So California had mandates,
Sure.
You couldn't work in a hospital, for example, without being vaccinated. I couldn't teach at the university without being vaccinated. There were mandates in place that applied across the state, but they were enforced more or less, rigorously depending on the local politics. Because at the end of the day, it's enforced locally. And the answer is Shasta's mortality rate was about a third higher, which doesn't sound spectacularly higher until you actually think how many people you're talking about. And it meant that there were many, many hundreds of people in Shasta who probably died needlessly because they were surrounded by a culture that discouraged vaccination. And so they had extremely low vaccination rates. And for children, it was almost non-existent. So, the kids weren't dying, but they were obviously spreading COVID in 2020 and 2021. So the answer is yes, there are measurable impacts when local government goes off the rails and sort of basically goes to war with its own public health officials. The public pays the cost. And I think, that's true across the country.
And did the public notice?
That I don't know. The answer is there were certain progressive journalists. There's a woman called Donnie Chamberlain who's been a sort of, screaming from the rooftops. She runs an progressive online news outlet called a News Cafe, and she's been screaming from the rooftops about this for months or years. And there were certainly other progressive organizers in Shasta who were well aware of this. But by and large, the public in Shasta was so hostile to mask mandates and so hostile to any kind of lockdown that I would say no, it probably didn't register with most. And
Interesting.
The other thing is there's always data out there. There is the I can't remember what it's called. The vaccine response. Dean, what's the name of the database for adverse effects for vaccines?
Oh, at the FDA?
No, it's called AVERS or something. The thing is, it's a national database on adverse reactions to vaccines, but it's unverified. So somebody can have the vaccine, die of a heart attack a day later, and it gets listed as possibly a reaction against the vaccine. Well, it could have been, but it could have also been coincidence. There isn't that sort of passing of correlation and causation. So the numbers that float around in Shasta are those numbers, the adverse responses to vaccines, and
So-called.
they're pushed all over the place, and those are the numbers that people are aware of and quote. And I found that really interesting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Sasha.
Hello.
Talk to us a little bit about what you said about social media, which is, in my view, one of the most toxic things in our environment these days. Because, okay, Trump may go away, inshallah, but the media is still there, and people find communities in many places. You spoke about the impact at the local level of people coming together and recognizing government isn't working, but people have other communities online where they can feed their fantasies over and over again. And I was sort of dismayed at the Surgeon General's piece about social media, because he didn't really offer a solution other than to say, take your kids off it. What do we do about this?
Cindy, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably write a book that would sell way more than this one will. But I don't know, because social media is so omnipresent, and even if you could ban it, you probably shouldn't ban it, because there are good sides to it amidst the toxicity. I can organize a book reading in a way I couldn't have 30 years ago. You can put out a public health thing very quickly. There are ways in which it's important, and there are ways in which it's, I don't know if it's enriched our lives, but it makes our lives more efficient in some ways, and it makes our ability to communicate and to create movements very, very rapidly. It makes it much more possible. It isn't going away. So the question, therefore, is how do you modify it? Can you put in place laws, for example, that hold executives accountable when violent misinformation is spread online, and then people act on that? So, I'm sure some of you read about what happened in England last month. There was this horrible situation where a young man went into a small town in northern England and stabbed several girls to death. And within hours, probably minutes, these rumors had spread online that it was an undocumented immigrant, an asylum seeker, who had done this. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was someone who'd grown up in Wales with legal status. His parents were immigrants from Rwanda, but he was neither Muslim, which is what some of the rumors said, nor was he an undocumented immigrant. But this rumor mill spread like wildfire, and it was fueled on Twitter, or X, or whatever the hell it's called now, because Elon Musk had re-platformed these violent extremists who were members of these fascist organizations in England, who had been deplatformed and had sort of not been able to communicate to a large audience, and Elon Musk re-platformed them. And then Elon Musk did even worse. He started circulating these bloody rumors. Musk himself gave the imprimatur of approval. He started tweeting out these things that the British government was preparing concentration camps for right-wing protesters, that they were going to send them off to the Falkland Islands. He started tweeting out these things saying that people were going to be put to death in a few years in England for having the wrong views about race. Musk should be prosecuted. He should be prosecuted for incitement. So, my feeling is, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. Social media is a part of our lives. But as democratic societies, we have to get a legal handle on holding those social media executives to account when their platforms are used to fuel violence. And that's the best I can do. I mean, it's imperfect. It won't cure the fact that social media, does all kinds of damage to teenagers' mental health, for example. That's a whole different story. It won't necessarily improve the fact that social media is a lousy way for distributing news because there are no gatekeepers and there are no editors. But it's a start. So I think the start is we have to have legal apparatus in place to hold social media to account, basically.
Thanks.
I wish I had a better answer. Do we have time? I don't know where the organizers are. Do we have time for a couple more?
Yeah,
two more.
5 minutes. Yeah.
So I'm wondering what role the school boards were playing, because, as you know, Steve Bannon said the road to power is through the school boards. Did they start with the school boards, or did they start with the city apparatus?
In Shasta's case, it was pretty much simultaneous. So they started fielding candidates with a distinct Christian nationalist bent for the school boards at the same time as they began recalling moderate county boards of supervisors. I tend to think it's sort of these movements don't focus just on one place or another place. You know, like any movement, left-wing or right-wing, if they're a good movement, they focus on multiple sort of entry points simultaneously. And I think, you know, Christian nationalist movements taking over school boards have been extraordinarily effective in the last few years. And, you know, in some ways, they give organizing lessons to the left. The right did a really good job for about 5 years. They just did it for rather insane ends. But in terms of organizing at a local level, they hit the ground running. And school boards, there's nothing better to mobilize people than the school board because it affects so many families. So if you can shape the political narrative at school board meetings, you got a huge head start in local political races. And the right was very good at it for a few years. You get the last question, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. When Bolivia had a coup d'etat, and Musk was asked if he had any role in that coup d'etat, he said, yes, and I'll do it again. Anytime there is a government that threatens my interest, I'll work against them. Okay. He said that. That's in the press. I mean, it's not a secret. He is now having a fight with the Supreme Court in Brazil. Right. Brazil has a Supreme Court. It's not a banana republic that you walk in and tell the judiciary what to do. And what he wants to do is to change the law or to proceed with the way he's behaving in Brazil. So talking about, and the whole thing here is that the Brazilians block some of the accounts of people who were spreading lies and very provocative things that could even result in something like happen in England and something like that. So they sort of try to control that stuff. Okay. Musk says, you know what? They have their law, but I have my goals. So I'm going to fight this. I'd like to have your reaction to this.
I'll give you a very short, concise reaction. It's outrageous. The idea of a private individual basically trying to undermine fundamental state institutions for his own private business interests is completely revolting to me. And, you know, I'll say what I said when Cindy asked her question. I think it's time for legislation to rein in the power of social media moguls. It's past time. It should have been done years ago. But Musk's behavior over the last year or two or three is so dangerous to the functioning of democracy, it has to be dealt with. You know, you can't turn a blind eye when one man has that much influence over global public discourse. So that's my answer. Listen, guys, I was told we had time for 2 more questions. You asked the questions. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you again for